Hey guys, tonight we drift into the smoky yellow glow of Victorian London, where the cobblestones gleam with damp and the gas lamps blur like tired stars. You stand on a narrow street that smells of coal smoke, horse sweat and cheap gin, and you hear the distant rattle of carriage wheels carrying someone important to someplace respectable. You're not going anywhere respectable tonight. You are walking straight into the parts of this city everyone pretends not to see, which, to be totally honest, is the part you probably would not survive 5 minutes in without catching something, losing your wallet, or both. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there, so I can picture you, tucked up somewhere cozy while we wander these dangerous streets together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand just off the Strand, in the heart of the city. The night is busy, not sleepy. Men in tall hats stride past with brisk, important steps, coats brushing your shoulder as they hurry toward bright theatres and music halls. Ladies in silk glide along the pavement, skirts swishing, gloved hands resting on the arms of husbands or brothers. The respectable world parades right in front of you, pretending very hard that the other world does not exist. But if you take one step into the side alley, everything changes. The respectable light of the boulevard falls behind you. Here, the gas lamps are fewer, and the shadows do most of the work. A woman leans against a doorway, shawl pulled tight, eyes assessing you in half a second. She notices your clothes, your posture, how nervous you are. She does this the way other people breathe. Someone once called women like her fallen, as if she tripped on a paving stone and never stopped falling. You know it is not that simple. In Victorian England, the word prostitute covers a whole messy spectrum. You have the streetwalker in the alley, the gay girl laughing on a theatre balcony, the discreet mistress installed in a rented flat, and the elegant courtesan whose client list looks suspiciously like the front bench of Parliament. Official reports from the time claim there are tens of thousands of sex workers in London alone. Some reformers insist the number is far higher. Historians still argue whether those tallies reveal the true scale of the trade, or mostly reflect the anxieties of fearful men counting women they barely understand. You listen to the city, and the nightlife has layers. From the Haymarket, you hear music drifting over the crowd, bright and brassy, advertising pleasure in shabby back streets of the East End. Laughter rings out from gin palaces where glasses clatter and voices rise, already slurred. A woman tugs a sailor's sleeve and murmurs something you cannot hear. He hesitates, then follows. Coins will shuffle from his pocket to hers, and to the landlord, and to whoever owns the room upstairs. The streets are a marketplace of bodies and secrets. You notice how carefully people avoid eye contact. The gentleman steps out of a carriage, glances left and right, then moves sharply toward a doorway with curtains drawn tight. You do not see his face clearly, but you see the polished walking stick, the tailored coat. He has a wife somewhere in a respectable square, maybe children asleep in a nursery. Tonight his footsteps sink into the same puddles as the bare boots of girls who cannot afford stockings. The city itself feels complicit. Gas lamps halo the figures on the pavement just enough to make everything look dreamlike. Fog curls around lampposts and blurs edges. It is practical, of course. Smoke and moisture and bad drainage. But it also gives the streets a kind of mercy. Things seen only half clearly are easier to ignore. That is one of Victorian England's specialties, seeing clearly enough to enjoy what it wants, and dimly enough to deny it later. You pass by a row of houses that look perfectly ordinary. Lace curtains, polished knockers, perhaps a potted plant in the window. Behind one of those doors, you glimpse a woman with hair neatly done, wearing a plain dress, not the flashy clothes you imagine from wild brothel stories. She looks like a landlady, and she is. Her lodgers, listed on the census as seamstresses or milliners, go out late and come back later. Neighbours pretend not to notice the men climbing the stairs at odd hours. One quirky detail from the period: some brothels actually hang up a card that reads modiste or dressmaker outside, so that anyone challenged can claim they only come for fittings. No one believes it, but everyone agrees to the fiction. You walk on and think about the way language tries to tidy this up. Newspapers talk about immorality, vice, and ruined girls. Official documents use phrases like common women or unfortunate females. The women themselves use more practical words: clients, work, money, rent. When they speak to each other, they joke, they complain about sore feet and cheap perfume that gives them headaches. One teases another about a client who snored so loudly she could not sleep. Even in the middle of all this tension, there is humour, because humans are constitutionally incapable of not making jokes. Even in a moral panic, Victorian England does something strange with these women. It makes them both invisible and intensely watched. On the one hand, everyone insists the country is the land of Christian morality, domestic purity, and angelic wives. On the other hand, police patrols quietly monitor known women. Pathologists and doctors write serious essays about their bodies, and moral reformers build entire careers out of rescuing them. You can feel the weight of eyes on every corner, but most of those eyes look through the women instead of at them. You pause near a busy intersection where several streets meet. This is a hot spot, even if no one uses that word. Women drift in pairs, pretending to be out for a walk. One adjusts her hat, another fiddles with her glove, small gestures that double as signals. A man slows his steps, hangs back, then falls into conversation with one of them. Their words are ordinary on the surface: weather and theatre and how late it is. The real negotiation is happening in looks and silences. For you, used to apps and profiles, it feels almost like watching a wordless code operate in real time. Above all this, church bells toll the hour, slow and solemn. The same bells call people to Sunday services and chime over streets full of sex workers on Saturday nights. That is the contradiction you keep bumping into. The empire builds railways and factories, sends missionaries overseas, writes poems about purity, and at the same time depends on a hidden economy of women's bodies to soak up the desires it does not want to admit. Historians still argue whether Victorian society genuinely believed its own strict moral codes, or simply learned to live with the gap between ideal and reality. You take a breath and feel the damp air in your lungs. Somewhere a cab horse snorts, shaking its harness. Somewhere a baby cries behind a thin wall. A drunk man sings a sea shanty off-key. This is not just a city of sinners and saints. It is a city of people trying to survive. For some women, selling sex is a last resort. For others, it is a cold calculation, a way to earn more than a laundress or a maid ever could. For all of them, it is woven into the stones you're standing on, kept quiet in public, yet impossible to scrub from the story of Victorian England, no matter how hard later generations try to make it look cleaner than it was. You stand at the edge of a railway platform that smells of coal and hot metal. A train exhales steam and you see her step down with a small bundle of clothes, a cardboard box, and a face that is trying its best to look brave. She's around 16, maybe younger, cheeks pink from the wind, boots scuffed from farm tracks. She's here to become a maid in the city, and she has absolutely no idea that people like her are the raw material of half the moral panic in Victorian England. You're about to learn how a servant can slide into the label of fallen woman faster than you lose socks in the laundry. You follow as she joins a cluster of girls in plain dresses, each holding a note with an address. Domestic service is the biggest employer of women in this period. In some cities, 1 out of every 3 young women works as a servant. That sounds safe and respectable on paper. You live in your employer's house, so you get food, a small wage, and in theory protection. In practice, you work from before dawn until long after dark. You sleep in a cramped attic room, and if anything goes wrong, it is always your reputation that takes the hit. Victorian job perks are not exactly HR approved. She finds the house listed on her scrap of paper. A tall, narrow building with polished steps and a bell pull. The mistress of the house looks her up and down, checks her hands for dirt, asks if she can sew, scrub, and keep her mouth shut. That last skill is the most valuable. Our maid nods. She moves into a world of endless chores, blacking grates, hauling water, scrubbing floors until her back aches. She eats in the kitchen, listens to the family laughter from another room, and learns quickly that she's both inside the home and not really part of it. At night, in the servants' attic, the girls whisper in the dark. They talk about wages so low that buying a new pair of boots feels like a wild luxury. They compare employers, some strict but fair, some stingy and suspicious. One quirky habit, from the time some employers make surprise checks of their maids' mattresses, convinced that secret lovers are being smuggled in under the blankets. You picture that inspection and try not to laugh out loud. For the women involved, it is not funny at all. Their entire future can hinge on one rumour, one locked door, one accusation they cannot disprove. One day, our maid notices the son of the house watching her while she polishes the silver. His eyes stay on her a bit too long. At first he jokes with her in the passage, asks about her village, compliments her hair. It sounds harmless, even flattering. She's lonely, far from family, and not used to handsome young men talking to her as if she matters. You see how easily kindness can blur into something else when the power is all on one side. If she says no, she risks her position. If she says yes, she risks her reputation. The fun little choice menu has no good options. Historians still argue whether servants in these situations had more agency than later moralizing accounts suggest, or were effectively trapped by economic dependence and fear of dismissal. Either way, you watch how a single night can rewrite a life. Maybe the son takes advantage while she's half asleep, or maybe she agrees, hoping for marriage that will never come. In any case, if pregnancy follows, everyone suddenly remembers the word morality, but only applies it to her. He keeps his allowance, she keeps the blame. When her belly starts to show, the household has decisions to make. Some mistresses quietly dismiss pregnant maids with a small payoff. Others push them out with no reference, which is basically the Victorian version of the digital footprint marked "Do not hire ever." Our maid finds herself in a lodging house with meagre savings and a baby on the way. Employers of respectable houses do not want questions attached to their staff, so domestic service options evaporate. You can almost hear the click as one door after another closes in her face. She tries other work in Victorian cities. Needlewoman sounds honest and homely, but it often means sitting in a cramped room 12 hours a day, sewing shirts for pennies per dozen. Laundry work is brutal on hands and back. Flower selling brings in coins only if the weather is kind and customers generous. The cost of rent eats most of what she earns. The baby needs food, clothing, a person to watch it while she searches for work. Charitable institutions offer a little help, but usually tied to lectures about sin and obedience. You realise that moral lectures do not magically create money, and they certainly do not pay landlords. One evening, she stands in a dark hallway, arguing with that landlord. She's behind on rent. He's not a charity. His eyes look her up and down in a way she recognises. He suggests another arrangement. That phrase is as old as time. Sometimes it is framed as protection, sometimes as pity, sometimes as business. The result is the same. Our maid decides, or feels forced to decide, that selling her body is the only way to keep herself and her child indoors. She tells herself it will be just once. You know how that promise usually goes, right up there with, "I will only check my phone for 5 minutes." The first client is awkward, frightening, maybe numbing. She disassociates, focuses on the wallpaper pattern, on a crack in the ceiling. He leaves coins on the table. She picks them up with shaking hands and realises they are more than she can make in several days of laundry or sewing. That is the brutal math that pulls her in. She can pay rent, buy bread, maybe even boots that do not leak in the rain. The trade-off is invisible at first, but it grows. Gossip in the building starts. The landlord becomes bolder. Respectable employers, hearing whispers, slam their doors a little faster. Before long, the city has a new word for her, fallen. That word sounds like gravity, did it? As if she simply slipped. In reality, you see how many hands nudged her low wages, exploitation in service, social rules that punish women harsher than men, lack of safety nets. Historians still argue whether Victorian prostitution should be viewed mainly as a result of poverty, of male demand, of urbanisation, or of limited female employment opportunities. You do not need a dissertation to see that the answer is messy and cruelly practical. She adjusts, the way people always do. She finds other women in similar situations and they share information. Which streets draw better paying clients, which pubs are too dangerous, which midwife is kind and which doctor is not to be trusted. They laugh together sometimes, a tired kind of laughter. One jokes that at least she now chooses when to get up in the morning, which is a pretty dark version of flexible hours. Another says that if virtue paid the rent, the city would be full of saints. Dark humour becomes one of the thinnest shields between them and despair. In the middle of all this, you catch that strange Victorian habit of turning real women into symbols. Reformers write pamphlets about fallen sisters as if they are a single tragic character. Novelists kill them off in melodramatic scenes, coughing delicately into handkerchiefs. Policemen list them as statistics in reports. Our maid is none of those things. She's a person who likes a particular song, who misses her mother, who sometimes buys a cheap ribbon just to feel pretty. The label prostitute tries to swallow all of that, but it never quite fits, no matter how neatly the moralists think it does. You stand on a quiet residential street that smells faintly of coal smoke and boiled cabbage. Compared to the noisy thoroughfares, it feels oddly polite. Front steps are scrubbed, brass door knockers shine, and lace curtains twitch when you look for too long. If you arrived here in daylight, you would probably think you were in a street of minor clerks and shopkeepers. At night, the story inside certain houses changes completely, and you find out that the most dangerous rooms in Victorian England often live behind the cleanest front doors. You stop in front of one tall house with a neat little sign that reads lodgings in tidy script. Nothing shocking there. London is bursting with people who need beds. When you step inside, a wave of warm air wraps around you. The hallway smells of perfume, candle wax, and something sweetly alcoholic. The landlady appears, skirt rustling, keys at her waist. Her hair is pinned tight, her expression sharper than any policeman's. She sees you the way a shopkeeper sees a customer, calculating how much money you are likely to spend before you have even said a word. She guides you through the house and you notice details. In the small parlour, velvet curtains mute the noise from the street. An upright piano waits in the corner, ready for a girl who can play a few popular tunes. Framed prints of classical scenes hang on the walls, a fig leaf of respectability. On the sideboard sits a decanter of cheap sherry pretending hard to be something finer. Officially, this is a boarding house for single gentlemen. Unofficially, it is one of thousands of brothels stitched into the fabric of the city. A mainstream fact slips in here in mid-19th century London. Official statistics sometimes list hundreds of brothels, but social investigators often estimate many more, since plenty of houses simply list themselves as lodging houses or private hotels. Historians still argue whether the official numbers massively underestimate the true scale, or whether moral campaigners inflated figures to shock the public. As you look around this elegant sham, you get the sense that whatever the number on paper, the reality is busy and very alive. The landlady leads you up a narrow staircase. Wallpaper with faded floral patterns crowds the walls, and the carpet muffles each step. On the next landing, you pass 3 doors. From one, you hear a burst of laughter. From another, the scrape of a chair. The third stays quiet, which somehow feels loudest of all. The landlady explains her house rules in a pleasant, firm voice. Payment in advance, no drunken brawls, no damage to furniture. Clients who misbehave are not welcome back. She keeps a mental list of troublesome men, and if necessary are like... She spreads warning gossip to other landladies. In a city this dense, reputation moves faster than a telegram. You reach a small sitting room where several women wait between clients. They are not dressed like the streetwalkers you saw earlier. Their gowns are cleaner, their hair pinned with care, their cheeks lightly tinted. Most would pass for dressmakers or governesses if you met them at the grocer's. They chat in low voices, needlework in their hands, as if they really are simply boarders spending a quiet evening. One quirky detail from houses like this, some keep actual sewing or trimming work on hand so that, if a surprise visitor appears, everyone can instantly transform into industrious seamstresses. The illusion is part performance, part survival. You listen as the women talk about rates and regulars. One mentions a client who always insists on the same room and arrives exactly at 9 every Thursday, as predictable as the church clock. Another laughs about a man terrified of candles who demands that every encounter happen in near darkness. Their stories have an edge of humour, but also careful observation. These women track behaviour patterns with the attention of experienced gamblers. They notice which men tip well, which grow rough when drunk, which get sentimental and start talking about their wives. The information is their security system. The landlady runs the house like a complex little business. She keeps ledgers in a locked drawer, listing rooms, names, amounts paid. Some women pay her a fixed rent for the room and keep what they earn. Others work on a shared percentage, handing over a cut of each payment. She arranges for clean linen, pays the maid, orders coal. If the police need to be paid to look the other way, she handles that too. Historians still argue whether women who ran brothels were mainly ruthless exploiters or struggling survivors using the tools available to them. In this house, you see both. She protects her girls when it protects her profits, but she is perfectly capable of throwing someone out if they become unprofitable trouble. There is rivalry in the air, subtle but real. One woman adjusts her bodice as another walks past, as if reminding everyone that she has the best figure in the house. When a new client arrives, you can feel the flicker of tension while the landlady decides whom to send. She claims to choose fairly, but you suspect she favours those who earn her more money or cause fewer complications. Behind closed doors, little alliances form. One woman might share clothes with a friend, or tips on flattering lighting. Another hoards information and whispers to the landlady when she wants someone else moved to a poorer room. Each room upstairs has its own character. One has red velvet drapes and a gaudy mirror trying to look luxurious. Another is sparse and plain, good for clients who fancy themselves respectable. A third has a shelf of cheap French novels, more for atmosphere than reading. You notice that the furniture is chosen with purpose. A bed sturdy enough to take abuse. A chair positioned near the door so a woman can stand between a client and the exit if things go wrong. A bell pulled to summon help. At least in theory, in practice, help arrives only if the landlady thinks the situation threatens the house more than it threatens the woman. From time to time, callers come who are not clients. A delivery boy with fresh bread. A coalman grumbling his way downstairs. Occasionally a well-dressed woman visits the landlady in private. She might be a supplier of clothing, or someone arranging discreet placements for girls who want to leave. It is hard to tell. The house is a crossroads where different social classes brush against each other in secret. Respectable married men arrive at the back door with their collars loosened, and their consciences parked somewhere around the corner. They step out afterward, hats straight again, faces calm, as if nothing has happened. You see how this network remains mostly invisible to the official face of the city. On census forms, the landlady may call herself a lodging housekeeper. The women might be listed as milliners or domestics. A police inspector walking the street can honestly say he sees only quiet houses with drawn curtains. Yet everyone who needs to know knows. Cab drivers, servants, local shopkeepers, even some policemen share unspoken maps of where certain pleasures can be bought. The most uncomfortable truth settles in while you watch this smooth operation. The brothel does not sit outside Victorian society as a freakish little island. It mirrors the same hierarchies, the same obsession with class, the same double standards that rule the drawing rooms and boardrooms. The landlady plays at being a respectable mistress of a house. The clients perform their roles as gentlemen even while doing things they will never mention in daylight. The women adjust their behaviour for each man, slipping in and out of personas the way others change hats. Nothing here is as simple as sin on one side and purity on the other. It is all negotiation, performance, and survival, carried out behind carefully drawn curtains that the city prefers not to pull aside. You stand in the bright crush of the West End, where gas lamps shine on polished shop windows and the pavements feel almost theatrical. Music spills from open doors, carriage wheels clatter, and you can smell roasted chestnuts trying very hard to cover the scent of sewage and smoke. This is the glamorous part of the city that polite people brag about in letters home. It also happens to be one of the busiest markets for buying and selling sex, and everyone pretends not to notice while noticing exactly everything. You drift toward the Haymarket, that famous strip between theatres and music halls. Men in evening dress wander slowly, newspapers folded under their arms as an excuse to loiter. Soldiers on leave swagger in uniforms that make them feel twice as brave and 3 times as foolish. Among them move the women the newspapers like to call nymphs of the pavement or Haymarket queens. You watch them weave through the crowd like they own the cobblestones, skirts lifted just enough to keep the mud off, eyes scanning for opportunity. Victorian observers write about these women with a weird mix of horror and fascination. One widely quoted investigation in the mid-19th century counts hundreds of prostitutes in the Haymarket area on a single night, and solemnly reports that the scene is one of the chief schools of vice in the capital. Historians still argue whether such reports reflect a genuine explosion of sex work, or mostly reveal how obsessed middle-class men were with counting women they claim to despise. Whatever the statistics say, you can see that the trade here is open, noisy and practiced with the confidence of street performers. A woman in a bright blue dress catches your eye. Her hat is trimmed with an artificial flower that has seen better days. She walks slowly, turning her head just enough to invite conversation. When a potential client makes eye contact, her smile appears instantly, as if it has been waiting in her pocket. Prices are not shouted. They are murmured in doorways, wrapped in jokes and half-promises. A hand brushes a sleeve, a laugh lands a little too easily, and a man who swore he was only out to see a play finds himself negotiating behind a lamppost. Streetwalkers here know the geography like a second skin. Certain corners belong to certain women or groups. If you stand in the wrong spot too long, someone will make it very clear that you should move. One quirky detail from some accounts describes women tapping their heels in a particular rhythm on the pavement as a warning signal when police approach. It sounds almost like a little dance step, but under the music and chatter, it is all about keeping out of trouble or at least one step ahead of it. You turn into a narrower side street where the mood changes. The bright theatre lamps fade behind you, and the crowd thins into clusters of men and women pressed into doorways. These are the poorer night walkers, women who work whenever they can, following the traffic from pubs and music halls. Their dresses are shabbier, their shawls pulled tight against the cold. They cannot afford the luxury of picking clients carefully. A sailor lurches toward one, breath smelling of cheap gin and sea air. She negotiates quickly, eyes flicking to his pockets, then leads him toward a darker alley. The whole exchange takes less time than you spend trying to decide what to watch on a streaming service. The economics of it hit you. A streetwalker might earn more in a single encounter than in a long day of charring or factory work, but the price is risk, in every possible sense. Violence lurks in the shadows. Disease waits in the bodies of men who never bother to learn the word hygiene. Respectable society holds its nose at the women while quietly forgiving the men. Historians still argue whether clients felt genuine guilt or simply framed these nights as harmless adventures. Judging by how casually some of them stroll past you, guilt seems to be a very flexible emotion. Not all sex workers in this district cling to the pavement. Some operate out of taverns and singing saloons, using performance as a kind of shop window. You step into a music hall where the air is thick with smoke and laughter. On stage, a woman belts out a comic song, skirts slightly shorter than fashion strictly allows, winking at men in the front row. When she finishes, she joins the drinkers, laughing and chatting, accepting glasses of ale. Behind the jokes, she is also evaluating who might pay for more than a song. For some, the stage is a route to better paying private arrangements. For others, it is simply another way to compete in a crowded market. In contrast, higher-priced courtesans rarely walk these streets at all. You catch glimpses of them only indirectly. A handsome brougham carriage draws up outside a theatre, and an elegantly dressed woman steps down. Gloved hand on the arm of a wealthy man. Her dress is fashionably daring, her jewels impressive. People whisper that such women sometimes earn more in a month than a factory girl can hope for in a year. They live in private apartments, receive gifts, and read French novels that moralists warn about. The line between mistress and prostitute blurs heavily here, and no one likes to admit how porous it is. Even within the same city, sex work looks very different from neighbourhood to neighbourhood. In the East End, you move through streets where the gas lamps are fewer, and the smell of poverty hits harder. Here, some women work from shared lodging houses, arranging quick encounters in stairwells and tiny rooms. Others lean against railings by the docks, targeting sailors paid in lump sums who may not see land again for weeks. The language shifts too. In one area, women are called gay girls, in another unfortunates, and in yet another simply the women down that street. The labels change, but the reality of trading intimacy for survival stays grimly similar. You stand beside a pub doorway and listen as two women compare notes. One complains that soldiers haggle too hard. Another says clerks are stingy but at least less likely to throw punches. They share addresses of known violent men the way people share restaurant reviews, except the stakes are much higher than a bad meal. There is a dry humour running through their talk. One rolls her eyes and says she should charge extra for listening to men recite bad poetry. Another declares that if she had a shilling for every client who claimed his wife does not understand him, she could retire tomorrow. They laugh, and you hear how joking becomes a way to carve out a tiny bit of control. The police presence varies with district and with the mood of the authorities. In some streets, constables look away unless the trade becomes too loud or blatant. In others, they crack down hard, pushing women along, hauling them to court for soliciting or disorderly conduct. A single charge can mean a fine that eats most of a week's earnings, or a short spell in prison that breaks fragile routines. For men, the law is often much kinder. Many clients simply walk off into the night, collars straight, reputations untouched. As the night deepens, the streets empty slowly, theatres close, pubs ring last orders, and shop shutters slam down. Yet in corners and alleys, business continues. You notice how often sex is traded alongside other things, like food, alcohol, or a place to sleep. A woman might agree to spend the night with a landlord in exchange for delayed rent. Another might combine sex work with pickpocketing, fingers slipping as deftly as any professional thief's. One quirky twist in some busy districts has women teaming up with thieves, distracting clients while their partners go through pockets. If multitasking were an Olympic sport, these women would have medals. You walk away with the city still buzzing around you, realizing that words like streetwalker and courtesan flatten a world that is anything but simple. Each corner has its own rules, prices and dangers. Each group of women adjusts to the rhythms of its chosen territory, reading the crowd with practiced eyes, making snap decisions about safety and profit. The the streets themselves seem to breathe with the stories of these negotiations, the quick glances, the whispered offers, the hands that meet for a moment and then separate, leaving behind nothing visible except a few coins and a little more weariness in the faces that stay. You wake up in a polished London townhouse that smells of coffee, ink and furniture polish. On the pillow beside you lies a perfectly folded copy of the morning paper, full of sermons about national greatness and moral progress. You sit up, straighten an imaginary cravat, and step into the role of the Victorian gentleman, which turns out to be a lot like method acting with extra starch and fewer honest conversations. You walk downstairs into a dining room where the silver glows and the maid keeps her eyes carefully lowered. Your wife pours tea with practised grace, talking about charity meetings and a new sermon on purity. You nod along, because nodding is one of your best skills. Inside, some quiet compartment of your mind is already planning the evening, and it has nothing to do with purity. It has a lot to do with a certain street, a certain door, and a woman who knows you only by a name that is not yours. Victorian gentlemen build entire lives out of respectable routines. You go to the city to work as a clerk or merchant, or you sit in Parliament, listening to debates about morals and public decency. Mainstream medical writers in the 19th century regularly insist that respectable men should practice self-control, and that prostitutes are a threat to the health of the nation. At the same time, those same texts calmly accept that many men will visit sex workers as if it is a grim sort of inevitability. Historians still argue whether this contradiction reflects genuine moral struggle or a convenient way to excuse male desires while blaming women for the consequences. You watch a day unfold. In the morning, a politician stands up in the House of Commons and speaks in a grave voice about the importance of protecting homes and families. He uses words like virtue, duty and sacred trust. The men around him murmur approval. In the afternoon, some of those same men stroll into gentlemen's clubs with heavy curtains and deep armchairs. They drink brandy, talk about investments, and empire, and joke quietly about the larks they had when they were younger. The laughter says they are not actually finished with such larks at all. One quirky detail surfaces in the gossip of the time. Certain guidebooks circulate privately among men, little handwritten or printed lists that rate brothels the way modern apps rate restaurants. They include helpful remarks like good French wines and discreet entrance inside alley. A few even mark which establishments are popular with officers, lawyers or actors. It is like a secret tourism industry, complete with customer reviews, just without the star ratings. Owning such a list would be scandalous if discovered, yet they pass from hand to hand in smoky club rooms, quietly thumbed and updated. You follow one particular gentleman, because it's easier to understand the hypocrisy when you step inside a single, double life. By day, he is a solicitor, neat beard, neat handwriting, neat little opinions about the failings of the lower classes. He writes a letter to a newspaper supporting stricter laws against disorderly women. In the same pocket where that letter sits, he carries a folded card from a madame who runs a fashionable house near Piccadilly. He tells himself that these are entirely different matters, the way people tell themselves that cake eaten standing up has no calories. As dusk falls, he leaves his office, tips his hat to acquaintances, and tells his coachman he has an evening appointment. The coachman knows perfectly well what that means. Servants in this world see almost everything and say almost nothing, because silence keeps them employed. The carriage rolls through streets that grow darker and less respectable with every turn. Your gentleman rearranges his face in the reflection of the window, smoothing away any sign of nerves. He is very proud of how ordinary he looks. When he arrives outside a discreet house, he does not knock at the front door. He slips down a side passage and taps on a smaller entrance. The maid who answers recognizes him. She does not use his real name. He pays extra to register under a different one, and he likes to imagine that this protects his reputation, as if scandal is allergic to pseudonyms. Inside, warm light, laughter and perfume wash over him. For a few hours, he can shrug off the careful posture he wears in drawing rooms and offices. He tells himself that what happens here is not the same as betrayal. It is simply relief, indulgence, or whatever other word lets him sleep at night. Historians still argue whether most Victorian clients viewed sex workers as fellow human beings or as anonymous instruments. Diaries and letters offer glimpses in both directions. Some men write about affection, concern, and even attempts to help particular women. Others describe their visits in cold, transactional language, as if they are discussing a haircut. You can sense that, whatever their private feelings, the public script demands one thing: blame the woman, protect the man, and never let the two worlds overlap in polite conversation. You watch him return home later, shoes now dusty with the same dirt trodden by cab drivers and charwomen. He steps into a hallway where the air smells of soup and candles. His wife looks up from a book and smiles. He kisses her hand, not her mouth. This is their little ritual. She asks if his business went well. He says yes, because no one ever means that question literally after sunset. Upstairs, in a nursery, a child sleeps peacefully, unaware that a sickness might ride home some night inside a father's blood because of encounters he will never confess. The government, thinking in its own lopsided way, introduces measures aimed at venereal disease. Certain port and garrison towns fall under the Contagious Diseases Acts, and women suspected of prostitution can be subjected to forced medical examinations. Men, who supply the other half of every infection, walk free of such intrusion. Publicly, these laws are presented as acts of protection for soldiers and sailors and for the nation's future. Privately, they send a clear message. Men's bodies are to be defended. Women's bodies are to be policed. One side of the transaction remains nearly invisible to the law. You imagine what it feels like inside the gentleman's head. On Sunday, he hears sermons that condemn fallen women and warn pure young men to avoid temptation. On weekdays, he lunches with colleagues who joke about mistresses in the same breath as investment opportunities. At home, he listens to his wife read religious tracts that talk about the sanctity of marriage. Somewhere under all that, a small voice might whisper that what he is doing is wrong. He smothers it with habits, excuses, and the belief that respectability is about what people see, not what actually happens. His conscience, if it had legs, would probably pack a bag and leave town. Not every gentleman behaves the same. Some marry late and visit prostitutes only briefly in their youth. Some maintain long-term relationships with particular women, paying for apartments, clothing and secrecy. A few genuinely fall in love with women society refuses to accept as respectable. Historians still argue whether such relationships offered the women real security or simply locked them into dependence on a single man's favour. Whatever the answer, the pattern repeats. Men step back into the warm circle of society even after scandal. Women, once exposed as common, find that circle has no place for them at all. You end the day with that image of the man who can condemn with one hand and pay with the other, who can sign a petition for reform in the morning and knock softly on a brothel door at night. Victorian hypocrisy does not look like wild villainy. It looks like a polished boot stepping carefully over a puddle, careful not to splash itself, and never mind what happens to whoever is already standing in the water. You stand at the corner of a busy London crossroads, watching a blue-coated constable swing his truncheon like a lazy metronome. His pace is slow, almost casual, but his eyes move constantly. He's not just keeping order, he is sorting people into invisible categories: respectable, suspicious, profitable. You can almost see the calculation flicker behind his calm face. In this world, a uniform can mean protection, punishment, or a hand quietly held out for a little something extra in exchange for looking the other way. The Metropolitan Police have been patrolling these streets since the early 19th century, designed to bring a sense of modern rule and discipline to the turbulent city. Officially, they are guardians of public peace, sworn to uphold the law fairly. On paper, that sounds comforting. Out here on the pavement, it feels very different if you are a woman working the streets. The line between law enforcement and harassment is thin and constantly shifting like the London fog. You follow one constable as he moves down a row of taverns and music halls. Women stand in doorways, shawls around their shoulders, calling softly to men as they pass. When the officer appears, the atmosphere changes. Conversations snap shut. Smiles fade, replaced by guarded looks. He does not need to shout. A single raised eyebrow, a slight jerk of his chin, sends some of the women drifting farther along the pavement. The message is clear: you are tolerated here only as long as your presence does not embarrass the people in charge. Prostitution itself is not exactly illegal, but most of the activities around it are. Laws against soliciting, vagrancy and running disorderly houses give police plenty of tools. A woman who lingers in one place too long can be accused of loitering with intent. A group laughing too loudly outside a tavern can be written up for causing a disturbance. A landlady whose rooms see too much traffic can find her name in a magistrate's book. Historians still argue whether the police genuinely focused on stopping crime or quietly acted as moral regulators for the nervous middle classes. You notice that enforcement is rarely equal. A well-dressed man exchanging a few quiet words with a woman might walk away untouched. The same woman, approached later by a poorer, drunker client, may suddenly become the problem. The constable pushes her along, warns her about being seen too often in the same spot. If he is in a foul mood, he takes her name and threatens court. The law might be printed in books, but the way it lands on actual bodies depends heavily on the temper of the man in uniform and the social status of everyone involved. Sometimes the night erupts. You hear shouting at the entrance to a narrow alley. A patrol of officers storms in, boots heavy on the cobblestones. Someone has complained about a disorderly house, or a superior has ordered a crackdown to make the statistics look good. Doors are banged open, women dragged out, clients hastily trying to adjust their clothing and their dignity at the same time. One man sputters that he is a respectable gentleman. The officers ignore him for now. They know his name will disappear from the report as soon as he can speak to the right magistrate. Inside the station, the women are lined up, names taken, ages guessed more than asked. Some are fined, sums that will swallow most of a week's earnings. Others face a short prison term if they cannot pay. Cells are cold and crowded, the straw on the floor stale. For repeat offenders, the sentences lengthen. One quirky practice appears in some local courts where magistrates lecture the women at great length about virtue, sometimes longer than the trial itself. It is like being trapped in the worst motivational seminar of your life. Except at the end you also lose your money and your freedom. Out of public view, a different kind of exchange happens. In some districts, police and sex workers develop a rough, uneasy understanding. A woman might slip a constable a few coins so he will warn her about an upcoming raid. A madame might make regular payments to ensure her house is left off the list when inspectors come around. Officers might expect free or discounted services in return for protection. None of this appears in official reports. Of course, you imagine how awkward that paperwork would look. Perks one free visit per week in lieu of bribe. Historians still argue whether corruption in vice policing was widespread or restricted to certain districts and individuals. Contemporary scandals reveal at least some constables taking money, drinking in brothels while on duty, or exploiting their power over women who feared arrest. It is hard to measure exactly how common such behaviour is, because everyone involved has strong reasons to lie about it. What you can see clearly is that the possibility always hangs in the air like a smell. Every glance between officer and sex worker carries the question, will this be threat, negotiation, or both? You watch an encounter play out on a dim corner. A woman in a faded red dress has been unlucky tonight. No clients, rent due. The constable stops her, accuses her of obstructing the pavement. She knows this is thin, but arguing will only make things worse. He hints that if he sees her again, he will take her in. Then, almost casually, he suggests that a little something might persuade him to be more understanding. Money, if she has it. or something else if she does not. The choice is bitter. Give up part of what she earns, or risk losing all of it and her freedom too. You feel your teeth clench at how neatly the trap is set. Sometimes the women turn the tables. They watch the police just as carefully as the police watch them. They learn which constables are more sympathetic, which can be flattered, which are too lazy to bother with formal charges. One woman might flirt lightly with an officer to keep him in a good mood. Another might threaten, very quietly, to mention a certain visit he paid to a certain house while off duty. Nothing is written down, but the memory is there, and it can be a form of leverage. If hypocrisy had fingerprints, they would be all over these exchanges. There are also moments when the system shows a different face. A young constable fresh from training might genuinely feel pity for the women he sees, steering them away from trouble instead of toward the station. A few officers help girls escape violent pimps or dangerous houses, using their knowledge of the streets for something like protection. Those stories sit awkwardly beside tales of extortion and abuse, but they exist, muddying any easy picture of villains in blue and victims in shawls. Real life rarely lines up neatly with its own rules. Rumours of police involvement reach the newspapers from time to time. Scandals erupt when evidence surfaces that certain officers frequent brothels or take bribes. Commissions are formed, reports written, speeches made about rooting out corruption. For a while, the patrols become stricter, more nervous. Then, slowly, routines slip back into familiar patterns. You get the sense of a machine too big to fully clean, only occasionally polished where the public can see. You stand once more at that crossroads as the night thins toward early morning. The constable you watched at the beginning leans on a lamppost, rubbing his tired eyes. The women he pushed along have found other spots, other corners. A coach rattles past, carrying someone important home to bed. The city pretends it has been kept safe by the watchful presence of the police. You know that what has really been managed is visibility, as long as vice stays in the shadows, behind certain doors and under certain arches. The official story can claim that order rules the streets, even if that order is built on fear, favours and quiet deals struck between those who hold power and those who cannot afford to defy it. You stand in a cramped back room that smells of vinegar, sweat and something metallic underneath. A single oil lamp throws yellow light over a wooden table, a chipped basin and a bundle of stained cloths. A woman sits on a chair with her skirts gathered awkwardly, eyes fixed on a crack in the plaster. Her hands twist in her lap as she waits for the man who calls himself a doctor, though no certificate hangs on his wall. Sex work in Victorian England does not only trade in coins and secrets, it trades in microbes that no one can see, yet everyone fears. Words like syphilis and gonorrhea move through conversation in whispered code. People say things like the pox, a private complaint, or a touch of something French. Respectable families pretend such illnesses belong only to the poor, the reckless or foreigners. Hospitals and military reports quietly prove otherwise, with wards full of soldiers, sailors and clerks suffering the same burning, sores and slow fevers that tear through the bodies of the women they visit. You watch the so-called doctor bustle in, sleeves rolled up, breath sour with gin. He glances at the woman for barely a second before reaching for a bottle. Mercury solution, he says, promising it will draw out the poison. Mainstream medical practice of the time often relies on mercury for venereal diseases, despite its own poisonous effects. Patients shiver, drool, lose teeth, and sometimes die from the cure as much as the illness. Historians still argue whether practitioners truly believed in these treatments or simply clung to them because nothing better seemed available. The examination is rough, quick, and humiliating. There is no privacy screen, no gentle explanation. The woman grits her teeth and stares harder at the wall. She's paying for hope, or at least for the chance to keep working. If she cannot, there is no sick pay. no convalescent home waiting. Illness means no clients, and no clients mean no food, no rent and possibly the street. Health becomes a kind of currency, spent a little more with every encounter. Beyond these backroom quacks, there are official institutions. You walk past the high walls of a lock hospital, one of the specialised wards for venereal disease. Inside, beds line the room, occupied mostly by women deemed contagious. Some are sex workers sent under legal orders. Others are wives who caught disease from husbands but still find themselves treated with suspicion. Men are treated too, especially soldiers and sailors. But the language used about them focuses on restoring efficiency for service. With women, discussion circles endlessly around morality. The same symptoms, the same treatments, but completely different judgments. Legislation like the Contagious Diseases Acts allows police and medical officers in certain towns to force suspected prostitutes into examinations. Refusal can mean prison. Submitting means an invasive, painful procedure on a table that smells of carbolic and dread. You stand in the corridor and hear the clink of instruments, the murmur of nurses, the occasional choked sob. Reformers later campaigned fiercely against these laws, calling them state-sanctioned assault. Historians still argue whether the act significantly reduced disease among troops, or simply institutionalised the double standard that punished women for a problem both sexes created. Away from hospitals, a whole shadow industry of specialists thrives. You wander past shop windows stacked with patent medicines in fancy bottles, labels printed with promises in swirling script, cures for nervous weakness, remedies for youthful errors, drops for secret disorders. Most of these concoctions are mixtures of alcohol, herbal extracts, and sometimes opium. They soothe pain without fixing the underlying infection. For some clients, that is enough. As long as they can feel normal briefly, they convince themselves the danger has passed. One quirky detail peeks out from advertisements in newspapers and on handbills. Some doctors and chemists boast that their cures come with complete secrecy, no questions asked. Packages wrapped in plain paper and sent by post. The language sounds oddly familiar if you think of modern discreet deliveries. People in this period worry just as much about embarrassment as about illness. A ruined reputation can feel worse than a ruined body. For women in particular, admitting they need treatment risks being branded forever as unclean. You visit a cramped lodging house room where another woman lies on a narrow bed, a damp cloth on her forehead. She has tried the cheap pills, the nasty-tasting tonics, even a home remedy of boiled herbs recommended by a neighbour. Nothing has stopped the pain when she passes water, the swelling, the creeping weakness. A friend sits by the bed, counting coins, deciding whether to pawn a shawl to pay for a better doctor. The two of them talk quietly about clients, trying to remember who seemed sick, who complained of similar symptoms. They construct their own epidemiology out of gossip and guesswork. Rumours about disease move through the sex trade like wind through alleyways. One house earns a reputation for sickness, and suddenly finds its doorways less crowded. A certain soldier is said to have given 3 women the pox in as many weeks. Another client boasts that he always insists on protection, pulling a sheepskin sheath from his pocket with a flourish. Early condoms exist, made of animal intestine or rubber, washed and reused until they squeak like badly oiled boots. Some women welcome them as a small layer of safety. Others distrust them or find clients refuse to pay extra. In cramped waiting rooms of charitable clinics, you see a different scene. Religious reformers sponsor free treatment for fallen women, mixing medicine with moral lectures. A nurse in a starched cap hands out ointments and powders, while a matron insists that true healing comes from repentance and leaving the life. For some women, this feels like a possible escape. For others, it is just another place where their bodies become lessons in sin for respectable observers. The moment they step back onto the street to earn their bread, all those pious words evaporate. Letters and diaries from the period occasionally reveal men wrestling with fear of infection. The young clerk writes that he will never visit those houses again after a burning pain frightens him, then confesses to returning within months. Memory fades faster than desire. Medical pamphlets warn sternly that disease can be passed from father to wife and children, that syphilis can lurk quietly for years, emerging in terrible ways. You can imagine readers skimming these warnings, convincing themselves they belong to someone else. The quietest desperation sits in the spaces where illness meets motherhood. You picture a woman who has worked the streets since her teens, now with a baby whose eyes water constantly, whose skin erupts in sores. She suspects what this means, yet cannot bring herself to say the words. Taking the child to hospital might save it, but might also expose her past, her present, and every lie she has told neighbours about being a widow or a dressmaker. The decision gnaws at her while she pours yet another homemade syrup into a tiny spoon. By the time you step back from these rooms, clinics and hospital wards, the city outside feels different. Every bustling street suddenly looks covered in invisible threads of infection, connecting strangers who will never know each other's names. Disease turns sex work from dangerous commerce into a kind of slow lottery. With each encounter, a ticket that might be blank, or might hold years of suffering. The women in these stories do not just gamble with clients, police and landlords. They gamble with their own blood and bones, usually without any real choice in the matter, hoping that luck and whatever crude medicines they can find will keep them moving long enough to face another night. You stand in front of a high brick wall with iron spikes along the top, the sort of wall that looks as if it has strong opinions about who belongs on which side. A neat brass plaque by the gate reads something like "Home for Penitent Women" or "Magdalen Refuge." The words are tasteful and pious, the architectural equivalent of a tight, polite smile. From the outside, it looks like a cross between a small convent and a respectable school. Inside, it is something stranger, a place that promises rescue while quietly filing the rough edges off the people it claims to save. You ring a bell and hear the echo rattle through a narrow courtyard. A small hatch in the door slides open. A pair of sharp eyes judges you in one swift glance. The gate creaks back and you step into a world tiled with rules. The air smells of soap, damp linen and the faint tang of carbolic. Rows of windows look down, many with bars or stout frames. A pale winter sun touches carefully swept flagstones. For a place devoted to fallen women, it feels almost aggressively clean. A matron approaches, keys at her waist like a badge of rank. Her dress is plain, dark, starched within an inch of its life. She speaks in a tone that somehow manages to be both kindly and unmistakably in charge. She is the queen of this small kingdom. She ushers you into an office where a wooden cross hangs above a desk piled with ledgers. On one wall is a list of house rules written in firm, looping hand. No idle conversation, no contact with men, no leaving without permission, strict obedience to prayers and work duties. It reads less like an invitation to healing and more like the terms and conditions you agree to without reading. Except here they actually matter. You watch as a new arrival sits trembling on a hard chair. Her clothes are worn, her hands twist in her lap. The matron asks questions, just name, age, former occupation, references if any. Sometimes the answers are written down faithfully. Sometimes a new name is assigned, a fresh start on paper if not in reality. In some homes, the women are given identical uniforms, plain gowns and aprons that scrub away any hint of individuality. One quirky detail from several institutions is the cutting of hair, cropped short or tidied harshly, partly for cleanliness and partly as a symbolic break from vanity. Imagine being told that repentance starts with your hairstyle. Religious and philanthropic groups across Britain established these homes in the 19th century, convinced that with enough prayer, discipline and hard work, so-called fallen women can be restored to virtue. Magdalen asylums. Rescue refuges and penitentiaries appear in many cities, sometimes attached to churches, sometimes run by independent charities. Historians still argue whether these institutions were primarily acts of compassion in a brutal world, or instruments of social control that kept female sexuality and poverty firmly under supervision. You can see pieces of both in every hallway. The new arrival is taken to a small room where she exchanges her clothes for the institutional dress. Her old garments are inspected, perhaps washed and stored, perhaps destroyed. With them go any small token she carried: a ribbon, a brooch, a letter. Possessions can be used for bargaining or blackmail. The staff say, better that everything be under proper authority. She is shown to a dormitory lined with narrow beds, each with a thin blanket and a folded nightgown. Over the door, another rule sheet watches like a paper guardian. Lights out at a fixed hour. Silence after prayers. No talking in bed. Your day in this place starts early. A bell clangs before dawn, yanking everyone from sleep. You join the line of women filing to the chapel, bare feet on cold floors, breath fogging the air in winter. Morning prayers are long and heavy with words about sin, repentance and redemption. The chaplain speaks about the lost sheep brought back to the fold. No one mentions that the sheep also scrub laundry. After prayers comes breakfast, usually something simple: porridge, bread, maybe weak tea. Conversation is minimal and watched. Gratitude is expected, or at least a good imitation of it. Then the real work begins. Many Magdalene homes run laundries or sewing rooms. You step into a steamy chamber where huge copper boilers roar and steam curls around piled sheets. The noise of beating, ringing and scrubbing fills your ears. Women haul baskets that seem too heavy for their thin arms. Soap stings cracked skin. Hours stretch, punctuated only by the occasional barked instruction from a supervisor. The laundry brings in money from outside clients such as hotels, institutions and private families, giving the home a steady income. Wages for the women, if they exist at all, are tiny. Mostly, their labour is framed as part of their moral rehabilitation. Nothing says spiritual growth like chapped hands and permanent backache. In another wing, women sit bent over sewing, stitching shirts and underclothes, hemming linens, patching whatever needs repair. The rhythm of needle and thread becomes its own kind of prayer, or penance, depending on how you look at it. A supervising sister walks the rows, checking stitches and posture. Talking is allowed only in low voices, if at all. In some homes, the women are forbidden to discuss their past lives, as if silence can somehow unmake what has already happened. Thoughts, like hands, are expected to stay tidily occupied. Visitors sometimes tour the premises. You follow a group of well-dressed ladies guided by the matron. They inspect the chapel, nod approvingly at the neat rows of beds, breathe in the clean smell of laundry. The matron introduces one particularly tidy young woman as a success story, someone reclaimed from vice. The visitors listen wide-eyed, then later tell the tale at tea parties as proof that their donations are not in vain. The women who still struggle, who sneak tears into their pillows or dream of the streets outside, do not get cameo roles in these uplifting anecdotes. Daily life here is full of small, telling details. Letters sent or received are often read aloud or censored, in case old contacts try to lure someone back to sin. Some rescue homes change the women's surnames, presenting them to potential employers as reformed but never revealing the exact nature of their supposed fall. On Sundays, the treat might be an extra slice of bread or a rare walk in the garden under close supervision. You can feel how the home offers safety from hunger and violence, yet replaces them with strict dependence and constant judgment. Officially, the goal is to prepare women for new lives. Some are placed as servants in the middle-class households, their time in the home quietly concealed. Others are encouraged to emigrate, shipped to colonies where demand for wives and domestic workers is high. There are stories of successful marriages and fresh starts. There are also tales of women dismissed when any hint of their past surfaces, dropped back into poverty with even fewer options than before. Historians still argue whether Magdalene institutions genuinely opened doors to new futures or mainly delayed the inevitable return to whatever work paid the bills. Not everyone stays willingly. Some homes lock doors and keep keys tight. Leaving early may require permission, a completed term of years, or a sympathetic relative willing to take responsibility. For inmates who arrive directly from prison or under legal pressure, the idea of choice is hazy at best. A girl who runs away risks being branded ungrateful or incorrigible, labels that travel quickly through charitable networks. It is hard to find refuge in a system that shares your file more readily than your wages. You sit for a moment in the chapel at evening prayers. The women's voices rise in a hymn about forgiveness, thin but steady. Some sing with eyes closed, clinging to the hope that a new identity really can overwrite the old. Others mouth the words, already quietly counting the days until they can leave, or until someone on the outside remembers them. The staff kneel in the front pews, confident that they are doing holy work. You feel the tension between safety and control pressing on every stone. As night falls and the dormitory lights dim, the building settles into a disciplined hush. Outside, the city glows with gaslight and restless movement. Inside, bodies lie in narrow beds, each carrying a story that has been boiled, scrubbed and pressed into a simpler shape, fallen, penitent, reclaimed. The idea of rescue here is not a wide open door to freedom. It is a long corridor lined with rules, at the end of which waits a carefully chosen future that may or may not fit the woman who has to live it. You sit at a rickety table in a cheap lodging house, a single candle fizzing wax down its side while coins glint in a shallow saucer. The room smells of boiled potatoes, damp walls and the faint trace of perfume that has seen better evenings. Across from you, a woman empties her pocket onto the table. Out tumble a few shillings, some worn pennies, a bent button and a scrap of paper with a client's address. This is the real story of her night, and it is a lot less glamorous than the moralists imagine. She sorts the coins into little piles with brisk fingers. Rent, food, clothes, everything has its own tiny hill. First, the landlady. That is non-negotiable. Lodging housekeepers do not take moral excuses instead of money. She nudges aside enough for the week, and already the saucer looks emptier. Then comes food, bread, a bit of meat if the night has been kind, maybe a splash of gin to numb the edges. After that, laundry. Clothes need to be clean enough to pass at least a quick sniff test. There is no money in looking exactly as tired as you feel. You mentally compare this with other work open to women in mid-19th century England. Many domestic servants earn somewhere between £8 and £12 a year, paid in drips, with board included. A factory girl might earn a few shillings a week for long hours among clattering machines. The woman at your table can sometimes make the same amount in a single busy night, which is the bait that keeps so many hooked. Historians still argue whether sex work offered some women a path to slightly higher earnings and independence, or simply disguised extreme precarity with the illusion of quick cash. You watch her pick up the smallest pile of coins, the one marked in her mind as something extra. That might mean new boots before the old ones fall apart. It might mean medicine. It might mean saving for a week when she's sick and cannot work. She considers, then sighs and slides those coins toward another small heap labelled, in spirit if not in ink, to pay off what I already owe. Debts add up faster than clients. A doctor who agreed to see her in secret. A friend who lent money for a child's shoes. A pawn ticket for the shawl she still misses. Quirky practices spring up around this constant juggling. In some poor districts, women form informal savings clubs, putting a few pennies each week into a common pot that pays out in turn. One week it might buy a winter coat for one member. Another week it might cover a month's rent. It is like a rotating piggy bank with gossip included. The risk is obvious. If the woman who holds the money disappears, the savings vanish with her. Trust becomes its own currency, just as fragile as the coins on the table. Clients do not always pay in straightforward ways. You listen as she talks through the night. One man paid partly in coins, partly in a ham he had borrowed from his employer's kitchen. Another offered theatre tickets, which she sold at a discount outside the door. Respectable goods slide sideways into the underground economy. Jewellery, pawnable objects, and even leftover food move through this network, traded, sold, or bartered. If there was a Victorian version of a loyalty card, it would probably be a client who brings both cash and something worth pawning. You follow her the next day as she takes a bundle to the pawnbroker. The shop is dim, lined with shelves of other people's emergencies, dresses, coats, boots, watches, all hang behind the counter like a ghost wardrobe. She hands over a pair of earrings given by a generous client months ago. The broker weighs them, squints, offers far less than they are worth. She knows he's cheating her, but arguing will not change the numbers. She walks out with enough cash to pay what she owes, plus a little slip promising she can buy the earrings back later for more than she just received. It is the vintage version of a terrible loan app. Addiction creeps along the edges of these finances. Gin is cheap, plentiful, and does a convincing job of making the world feel softer for a while. She tells herself she only drinks on bad nights, but lately every night seems to qualify as bad in some way. Opium, in the form of laudanum, lurks in tiny bottles on chemists' shelves, perfectly legal. A few drops in water take the edge off pain and fear. Then it takes more drops, then more money. The trade that once seemed like a way to earn quickly becomes a way to spend even faster, with hangovers included. You sit with another woman, older, more cautious. She counts out coins with a different rhythm. Her first pile is always savings, even if it is only a few pennies pressed into a jar hidden under floorboards. Over years, she has managed to buy a small stock of second-hand clothes which she rents to other women on busy nights. Dresses, shawls and hats hang on hooks in her room, turning her into a tiny fashion lender. It is a small but clever hedge, a way to keep some money flowing even when she cannot or will not work the streets herself. Historians still argue whether such enterprising strategies allowed some sex workers to climb slightly up the social ladder, or whether the constant threat of illness, violence and scandal smashed most long-term plans sooner or later. Surviving into middle age in this line of work already counts as a kind of grim success. The older woman shrugs when you ask about the future. She says she wants a little shop one day. Maybe she will reach it. Maybe she will not. Day to day, the coins on the table matter more than dreams. The cost of staying presentable is its own quiet drain. Dresses need repair, shoes need rosoling, hair needs oil and combs. Cheap perfume helps cover the smell of shared beds and city grime, and even the low-quality stuff is not free. You watch a girl debating between buying decent soap and buying a bit of ribbon to brighten her hat. She chooses the ribbon, because looking attractive brings clients, and clients bring enough money to buy soap later. It is a constant loop. If you ever complain about the price of shampoo, you might want to sit with that for a second. Bribes slip seamlessly into the budget. A coin for the constable who looks the other way. A tip for the tavern keeper who lets her linger without chasing her off. A small gift for the landlady to ensure she stays in a room with a door that locks properly. None of these payments appear in official reckonings of wages or earnings, yet they chew through income like mice. Safety is not free. It charges per night, collected in backhanded gestures and muttered agreements. Children add a whole new column to the mental bookkeeping. A woman supporting a child must think not only of rent but of milk, clothes, school fees if she's trying to give them a different track in life. Some send small sums home to country families who raise their children without ever being told exactly how the money is earned. Others create elaborate cover stories about dead husbands or vanished fiancés. The cost of these fictions is measured in gifts, occasional visits, and the constant strain of keeping stories straight. As you watch the candle gutter lower, the economics of desire look less like a river of easy money and more like a bucket with multiple holes. Coins come in as bright flashes, then trickle out in rent, food, shockingly expensive laundry, bribes, pawnbroker interest, bottles of gin and the endless struggle to appear just polished enough to keep clients coming. There are moments when a woman might feel briefly flush, tossing a coin to a friend or buying a hot meal instead of cold bread. Those moments are real, and they matter. But they sit on top of a fragile foundation where one bad week, one illness or one violent encounter can topple everything. In this dim room, with its wobbling candle and scratched tabletop, you see clearly that Victorian prostitution is not simply about sex, morality or scandal. It is about numbers. It is about the weight of coins in a pocket, the price of boots, the interest on a pawn ticket, the fee for a doctor, the bribe for a constable. Desire may be what draws clients through the door, but arithmetic is what decides whether the woman on the other side of it eats tomorrow. You stand at the foot of a narrow staircase in a small London house that smells of coal dust, cabbage and cheap soap. Somewhere above you a child laughs, high and bright, and for a moment the city outside falls away. You climb the stairs and step into a cramped front room with peeling wallpaper and a window that lets in more draught than light. A woman sits darning socks by the hearth. A little boy sprawled on the floor with a wooden soldier missing an arm. If you met her at this exact moment, you would probably guess she's a widow who takes in sewing. That is exactly what the neighbours think, which is very convenient, because it is not exactly true. She looks like any other working mother, hair pinned up, skirt practical rather than flashy. On a peg by the door hangs a man's coat and hat. You notice how carefully they're arranged, as if their owner has just stepped out and will be back for supper. When visitors ask, she says her husband works away at sea or on the railways. People nod, murmur sympathy, and do not pry too deeply. The truth is that the hat and coat once belonged to a client who left them behind after a drunken evening. She kept them as props. One quirky survival trick in tight-knit streets is to give the house a phantom male head, even if he exists only in stories and abandoned clothing. By day, she lives one life. She sends her son to a ragged school where charitable teachers try to hammer letters and numbers into restless minds. She queues for bread, chats with other women about the price of coal, complains about laundry that never dries properly. On Sunday, she sits in a pew at the back of a church, trying to keep the boy quiet while the vicar talks about virtue. No one in the congregation calls her a prostitute. They call her Mrs. Something, because that is the name she gave when she moved in, and people prefer tidy categories. At night, when the child is asleep and a neighbour agrees to keep half an ear open through the thin walls, she slips into different clothes. Not ball gowns, nothing theatrical, just a dress that fits a little tighter, a bit more colour at the neck, hair arranged with extra care. She goes out, sometimes to the same streets you have seen before, sometimes to meet regular clients who know to knock softly. A few come here, tiptoeing up the stairs past the broken wooden soldier. She keeps encounters brief, controlled, always listening for the smallest sound from the next room. It is like living in the two plays at the same time and hoping the casts never collide. Official records rarely admit this double life. On censuses, women like her often list themselves as charwomen, seamstresses or lodging housekeepers. Illegitimate children appear as boarders or nieces and nephews rather than sons and daughters. The statistic that roughly 1 in 5 births in some urban districts in the late 19th century is illegitimate slides across the page, without saying who raised those children or what their mothers did at night. Historians still argue whether the numbers underestimate the scale of hidden families supported by sex work, or simply reveal the limits of what people dared to confess to officials in stiff collars. Sometimes, the hidden family is not a child, but a partner who exists halfway between lover, protector, and boss. You sit in another small room while a man rolls a cigarette and a woman laces up her boots. He jokes lazily that he is her manager, which is a generous way of saying he spends a good portion of what she earns. She insists he keeps her safe from violent clients and street bullies. The reality is tangled. Some couples genuinely care for each other, sharing food, rent, and the occasional laugh. Others revolve around control, threats, and the constant unspoken knowledge that if she leaves, he might follow in more than just a romantic sense. There are also women who maintain two households, one with a family that believes she works as a servant somewhere else, another in the city where she actually earns her living. You picture a mother in a small village proudly telling neighbours that her daughter has a good position in town, while that daughter sits in a London room writing letters full of careful half-truths. She mentions her employer, the long hours, the tiredness, but not the line of men who file through. She sends money home regularly, coins that transform into boots for younger siblings or a new blanket for her father's bed. The family receives them as proof that hard work pays off. Neither side ever asks too many questions. In some cases, children grow up inside brothels and lodging houses, learning early which rooms they are never to enter after dark. You see a girl of 8 carrying coal up the stairs, stepping neatly aside as a painted woman descends with a gentleman on her arm. To her, this is normal. The house is just where she lives. The women her aunts in everything but blood and official titles. Sometimes the madam sends children away to boarding schools or relatives in the country, funding their education quietly. Other times, when money runs short, the youngsters end up in workhouses or baby farms, private homes that take in children for payment and are later exposed in scandals for neglect. Historians still argue whether sex workers as a group were more neglectful, more devoted, or simply more desperate in caring for their children than other poor mothers. Diaries and court records show examples of heartbreaking abandonments, alongside stories of fierce, protective love. One mother may leave a child at a foundling hospital gate wrapped in a shawl, and a note that begins with, "For the love of God." Another may fight tooth and nail in court to keep a child from being removed, even when respectable authorities insist that her profession makes her unfit. The idea that you can measure love by income or respectability crumbles quickly when you stand close to these struggles. You notice the constant tension between visibility and concealment. In some streets, everyone quietly knows which women go out late and come back later. Neighbours might choose to see them as widows, might accept a story about a husband at sea, because acknowledging the obvious would complicate life for everyone. Landladies accept rent in cash that smells faintly of perfume and tobacco, then join in prayer meetings where they lament the spread of vice. Children overhear snatches of adult conversation, connect clues in their own ways, decide what to ignore. Whole micro-communities operate on shared half-knowledge, unspoken agreements to keep certain questions unasked. You sit once more in that first room as evening closes in. The woman stirs a pot of thin stew while her son hums tunelessly and lines up his soldier for battle. She checks the clock, calculates how long she can stay before needing to change and leave. On the mantelpiece stands a small framed picture cut from an illustrated magazine, showing an ideal Victorian family father with newspaper, mother with embroidery, children spotless and serene. She glances at it, smiles crookedly and turns back to the pot. Her life bends around that image without ever fitting inside it. The world outside might label her with one word, might call her fallen and think the story ends there. Inside this narrow house, the story breaks into many parts. She is cook, cleaner, nurse, liar, bookkeeper, actress, sometimes lover, sometimes just a body hired for an hour, always a mother trying to stack coins high enough to keep a roof over a child who has no idea how complicated the arithmetic really is. The double life is not a glamorous masquerade. It is a daily act of balancing, of stitching two realities together so tightly that they hold just long enough to see another morning. You sit at a scratched wooden table in a smoky upstairs room, the kind of room that smells of spilled beer, cheap scent and secrets that will never be written down honestly. Around you, women lean back on rickety chairs, unlacing boots, rubbing sore feet, their faces loose now that the night is half done. Someone pours tea that might accidentally contain more gin than water. Conversation drifts from money to clothes to the main entertainment of the evening, comparing the strangest things clients have asked for. One woman, hair pinned with fading ribbons, grins and says her latest regular does not actually want much touching at all. He pays handsomely just to be scolded. She stands over him in her best imitation of a strict governess, calls him lazy and wicked, and occasionally taps his knuckles with a ruler. He thanks her afterward like a schoolboy who has just passed an exam. You imagine this same man by day, sitting behind an office desk, barking orders at junior clerks. The reversal is part of the thrill. Money buys him a miniature holiday from being in charge. Victorian England has a reputation for being rigid and prudish in public. Yet private desires can be astonishingly varied. Behind some perfectly respectable doors, clients request not romance, but elaborate little dramas. One man wants to be tied to a chair and ignored while his hired companion reads a novel aloud as if he's not there. Another prefers to crawl on the carpet with a collar around his neck, while a woman flicks a riding crop and calls him her pony. It is the kind of detail that makes you side-eye every gentleman who claims he goes riding at the club purely for the fresh air. There are entire establishments whispered about that specialise in punishment fantasies. Social investigators and moral crusaders of the time complain about flagellation houses, where clients pay to be whipped or birched by women dressed as governesses, maids, or even nuns. The reports are written in outraged tones, heavy with words like depraved and unnatural, yet the level of detail suggests someone is reading very attentively. Historians still argue whether these accounts describe a widespread phenomenon, or whether a few famous houses and a lot of feverish imagination got inflated into a national crisis. You listen as the women around the table share the coded language they use to navigate these requests. One says that if a man asks whether she is strict, or likes to keep order, she knows what sort of game he has in mind. Another explains that a little discipline usually means he expects a whip, a cane, or at least a firm hand and firmer voice. The word French does double duty, sometimes meaning kissing, sometimes more intimate services, depending on tone and context. Greek has its own separate meaning, for clients who want something still more taboo. It is like a secret vocabulary layered on top of ordinary talk. Advertising these preferences openly would invite trouble. Obscenity laws keep watch over printed material, and anything too suggestive can lead to prosecution. So information travels by whisper and wink. A brothel known for particular specialties might keep a certain kind of costume on hand, or hang a particular colour of curtain as a quiet signal to those in the know. A client might hear about a woman's talents from a friend at a club and approach her with a practised phrase. One quirky habit that sometimes appears, a man might mention a favourite scene from a racy novel, letting the woman know exactly what he hopes to replay without saying it outright. For the women, every unusual request comes with a weighing of risk against reward. Strange does not automatically mean dangerous, but it does mean unpredictable. Being asked to spank a man with a pillow hardly threatens life and limb, and might even provoke a laugh. Being asked to tie someone up, or to be tied up herself, raises more serious questions. What if he does not stop when she wants him to? What if he becomes violent or refuses to pay? You see them talk through these worries, setting their own private lines. One says she will shout and drop character the minute she feels truly afraid. Another always makes sure she is closest to the door. There are no written safety manuals, only experience and instinct. Historians still argue whether the fetish and kink side of Victorian sex culture involved mostly wealthier men, or whether such desires existed more evenly across classes. Surviving evidence often comes from the world of pornography and court cases, both of which favour the stories of those with enough money to make trouble. That does not mean dock workers and clerks lacked fantasies. It usually means they lacked the spare coins and private rooms to indulge them in the carefully staged ways the rich could afford. Desire is free, so props cost extra. In the corner of the room, a younger woman listens wide-eyed as others talk about client tastes that have nothing to do with lace or lipstick. One tells of a man who pays her double to keep her boots on and trample the hem of his expensive coat while he groans happily. Another rolls her eyes and mutters about the gentleman who insists she wear spectacles and call him "my little patient" while she pretends to treat him for imaginary ailments. If you have ever thought your own search history was embarrassing, imagine explaining this to a Victorian priest. Not all requests are playful. Some veer sharply into cruelty. You hear about men who want to see tears, who push hard past agreed limits in the name of a thrill. The women know the difference between a staged slap and real violence. They tell each other which clients to refuse, which to only meet in houses with other people nearby, which to avoid entirely even if they offer ridiculous sums. The stories carry warnings like footnotes. This one is fine if he stays mostly dressed. That one puts his hands around your throat and laughs. That other one drinks until he forgets there is another human being in the room at all. There is also the quieter category of unprintable requests that revolve not around pain but shame. Some men want to confess their secrets to a stranger who will never meet their family. They talk about affairs, debts, fears, then ask the woman to mock them for weakness. Others crave humiliation in more physical ways. To fulfill these, the women must become actresses of a high order, performing disgust, superiority or icy calm while carefully keeping their real feelings separate. You can imagine them switching off that mask as soon as the client leaves, laughing tiredly in the stairwell and wondering why so many powerful men want to be told they are worthless for an hour. In the end, what you see in this smoky upstairs room is not just a catalogue of odd tastes, but a kind of backstage view of power in miniature. The same society that crowns men as heads of households and leaders of industry also produces men who quietly beg to be ordered around, spanked, scolded, or turned into someone else's pet. The women who serve these desires must read each man quickly, decide which performance to offer, and judge whether the extra coins are worth the extra risk. As the group around the table breaks up, women drifting back to their rooms or out for one last client, the jokes linger in the air. They laugh about the man who tipped extra because his fantasy required her to mispronounce Latin, about the one who thought wearing a different hat made him unrecognisable, about the one who fell asleep halfway through his own carefully planned scenario. Under their laughter sits a layer of unspoken knowledge. Behind the respectable wallpaper of Victorian life, human desire bends into shapes that polite language has no words for. So people make up their own. And every night, in quiet rooms above taverns and behind lace curtains, women translate those strange, stuttering requests into performances that keep food on the table and secrets safely in the dark. You stand in a quiet front parlour that smells of roses and lamp oil, and for once the noise of the city feels very far away. The curtains are thick, the carpet soft, and the woman across from you sits with the poise of a duchess rather than a landlady. Her gown is tasteful, not gaudy. She stirs sugar into her tea and listens with a half smile while the man opposite her talks more than he ought to. He speaks about supply contracts, troop movements, names of important men who have enemies. He thinks he's only showing off. She hears something else entirely. The idea that brothels can double as listening posts is not unique to this time and place. In many countries across different centuries, women who sell sex also sell silence, and occasionally, when it suits them, information. In 19th century Britain, when the empire stretches over continents, fear of spies and foreign plots hums underneath the polite chatter of drawing rooms. Senior officials warn about secret agents from rival powers. Newspapers print dramatic accounts of espionage cases. Historians still argue whether governments truly believe that foreign spies haunted every port and club, or whether the worries often exceeded the actual threat. Either way, a careless sentence in the wrong bedroom can travel a very long way. You watch the man in the parlour grow more relaxed. He has seen the same woman several times now. He tips generously, expects careful discretion, and thinks familiarity equals safety. Tonight he is in an expansive mood. A new political appointment, a successful vote, a private grudge settled in his favour. He brags about it all. He mentions that a certain bill will pass because one particular noble has been persuaded behind the scenes. He laughs about a letter that could ruin a rival if it ever reached the wrong hands. The woman notes details without ever dropping her smile. She cannot write fast enough to keep up while he sits there, so she tucks facts away in memory. Later, when he is gone and the house settles, she will take out a small notebook and record key points in her own code. Names shortened, places disguised as flowers or colours, dates turned into harmless-looking numbers. One quirky little practice in some circles involves using laundry books as cover, with sensitive notes disguised as lists of shirts and collars. If anyone glimpses the page, it looks like boring housework. Sometimes, these details never travel further than the woman herself. Knowing things can be its own kind of insurance. If a powerful client grows violent or refuses to pay, she can hint delicately that she remembers what he said about that hidden loan, or that private agreement. A single line, casually dropped, is often enough to make him suddenly generous. This is not the flamboyant blackmail of melodramas, with letters flourished and villains cackling. It is quiet leverage, used rarely and with care, because pushing too hard can provoke a backlash from men who have more official power and fewer scruples. In other houses, information becomes a shared resource. You imagine a table in the kitchen where the madam and a trusted girl sit after closing, piecing together stories from different clients like a jigsaw puzzle. One reports that a certain merchant seems worried about French ships. Another mentions that an officer hinted at reinforcements heading to a specific port, alone. Each story is just gossip. Together, they sketch the outline of something larger. Historians still argue whether such patchwork intelligence ever reached formal networks on a regular basis, or whether most of it stayed inside informal webs of rumour. There are cases, documented in court and in newspapers, where sex workers appear directly in scandals over letters and secrets. A politician leaves a packet of papers in a room after an evening with a woman. She opens them out of curiosity, realises they are more than love notes, and suddenly holds something explosive. Maybe she quietly sells the documents to a journalist. Maybe she offers them back through an intermediary in exchange for a sum that could pay her rent for months. Maybe she is frightened and simply hides them, only to have them discovered by police later. The line between opportunist and victim bends with every telling of the story. You sit in an upstairs bedroom where a girl in a simple dress pulls a folded sheet from under her mattress. The writing on it is neat, the signature very recognisable to anyone who reads newspapers. The letter is foolish, sentimental and incriminating. It admits to voting in a certain way in exchange for money. It complains about colleagues. It names people who should not be named. The girl reads it aloud to a friend, both of them giggling and gasping. They could, if they chose, use this scrap of paper to force money from the man who wrote it, or they could pass it to someone who does that kind of work professionally. This is where the professional blackmailer steps in. Certain men and women make a living not from selling sex, but from exploiting those who buy it. They haunt the edges of brothel life, offering services that sound helpful and smell of danger. Need a safe person to hold those letters. Need someone to pass a message to that gentleman without using your own name. Need help finding a buyer for something that no one should have written down. They take their percentage and melt away, leaving the women as buffers if anything goes wrong. Quirky rumours swirl about specific districts where spy stories and sex mix more openly. A house near a major government office is said to host both clerks and foreign diplomats. Its parlour a kind of unofficial debating chamber where pillow talk crosses borders. In port towns, women chat with sailors from different navies, trading stories about ship departures and cargoes the way others swap recipes. Most of this talk goes nowhere. Occasionally, it reaches the ears of someone with a reason to care. A tavern keeper might mention to a local official that the French fleet seems unusually busy. A madam might quietly warn a contact that certain clients ask too many questions about fortifications. Mainstream fact lives inside these tales. In the 19th century, major European powers do run intelligence networks that try to gather military and political secrets. Agents listen in embassies, cafes and private homes, brothels with their mix of lowered inhibitions and expectation of silence, fit naturally into that world. Some governments even worry officially about information leaked through improper connections, a polite phrase that covers everything from drunken boasting to deliberate betrayal. Historians still argue whether specific prostitutes named in certain high-profile spy cases were conscious participants or simply convenient scapegoats when things went wrong. You picture a different kind of danger now. A woman might be pressured by police or private agents to report on men who visit her. She could be told that charges against her will disappear if she reveals what a certain politician says after his third glass of wine. She could be offered money by someone claiming to serve the crown, who may or may not be what he seems. Each choice brings risk. Help them, and she might earn enemies among the powerful. Refuse, and she might find herself suddenly raided, arrested, or quietly pushed out of her lodgings. In the background, blackmail always waits. A married man caught in a compromising situation knows he can be ruined not only socially but politically. A single letter, a photograph, or even a believable witness can destroy a carefully built career. Some pay desperately to keep their names out of court. Others gamble that no one will dare drag them into the light. The women and madams who hold these secrets walk a narrow path. They live in a world where one word can be worth more than a month of work, and also where the wrong word can bring policemen to their door at dawn. You stand again in that quiet parlour where the woman with the poised smile pours tea. The client has gone. The room feels still, like a stage between scenes. She leans back, closes her eyes for a moment, then reaches for her notebook. A name, a date, a phrase about a shipment, a line about a meeting that should not exist. The words look harmless in the lamplight. Underneath them lies influence. Not the loud influence of speeches and votes, but the soft pressure of knowledge held just out of sight. The image of the prostitute as only a passive body collapses in this setting. Here she is listener, archivist, potential broker of information. She might never sell a single secret. She might simply enjoy the security of knowing that if worse comes to worst, she has a few sentences locked in her memory that a frightened man would pay very dearly to keep buried. State secrets and bedroom whispers brush shoulders in these rooms, and you realise that in a world obsessed with respectability, the people most carefully ignored often hear the most important things. You step off the main road into a narrow lane that smells of damp paper and printer's ink. Shop signs lean over your head like nosy old men, and on one crooked board you read the words, "Books bought and sold." It sounds harmless enough. You push open the door and feel at once that this is not just a place for sermons and Shakespeare. The air is thick with dust, secrets, and a faint perfume that does not come from flowers. Somewhere nearby, Victorian England is quietly feeding its appetite for things it loudly pretends not to like. Inside, shelves sag under the weight of second-hand volumes. At first glance, you see religious tracts, improving biographies and thick novels bound in brown cloth. Then, as your eyes adjust, you notice a few slim, anonymous books pushed half a step back from the edge, as if they are shy. The shopkeeper, a man with ink-stained fingers and quick, nervous eyes, hovers. He asks what you're looking for in a tone that really means, are you safe to sell the good stuff to? Or are you going to ruin my day with a badge and a warrant? You drop a phrase you picked up from gossip. Something about French novels and illustrations. It is like knowing the password at a club. His shoulders ease fractionally. He slips between the shelves and returns with a book wrapped in plain paper. On the cover, when you peel it back, is a title that could mean almost anything. Something tame like Amusements of the Boudoir. Inside, the pages tell a very different story. Explicit scenes, coded jokes, women and men who behave nothing like the pale heroines of respectable fiction. The Obscene Publications Act of 1857 technically makes such material illegal to publish and distribute, but you can see plainly that the law is more of a suggestion than a barrier. Historians still argue whether this act truly reduced the spread of pornography, or mainly pushed it deeper into cleverer, more profitable hiding places. Printed erotica in this world takes many forms. There are text-only stories full of breathless encounters and improbable levels of stamina. There are booklets with woodcut or engraved images that look almost comical by modern standards, but carried a hefty shock value in their own time. There are more specialised works, obsessed with particular themes like whipping, cross-dressing or voyeurism, sold to customers who pretend they are buying a history of gardening. One mainstream fact tucked inside all this is that Holywell Street in London becomes notorious as a centre for such trade. So notorious that it earns nicknames about filth in newspapers that are secretly very aware of its address. Photography adds a new dimension. You leave the bookshop and knock at the side door of a small studio that advertises portraits and family groups. During the day, respectable customers sit stiffly in front of painted backdrops, while the photographer arranges their hands and tells them not to blink. In the evening, when shutters are drawn, another clientele arrives. Women who sell sex pose in stockings, loosened corsets, or nothing at all. Their images captured on glass plates that will later be printed as small cards. These French postcards, though often made in London or other British cities, circulate quietly in pockets, drawers and the back rooms of tobacconists. The process is slow by modern standards. The room smells of chemicals, and the model must hold a pose longer than anyone really wants to stay halfway undressed in a chilly studio. The photographer fusses with the camera, cloth over his head, muttering about exposure time. Sometimes the women pose with each other, arms linked or bodies intertwined. Payment is a few coins or copies of the images they can sell on to trusted clients. Historians still argue whether many prostitutes saw this as a welcome extra income stream, a risky sideline, or simply another way men made money from their bodies. Evidence survives in scattered piles of surviving prints, but their original negotiations are long gone into the darkroom. Quirky little details pop up in this photography trade. Some images are mounted on cards with innocent-looking fronts, like a bunch of flowers or a scenic view. The buyer flips the card and finds a nude on the reverse. In other cases, stereoscopic viewers, those little devices that show images in 3 dimensions, are used for double purpose. Families sit in parlours, enjoying pictures of mountains and foreign cities, while somewhere upstairs a hidden set of stereoscopic nudes waits for more private viewing. It is the Victorian version of having one folder called tax documents on your desktop that absolutely does not contain only tax documents. Not every image is studio made. You hear about roundsmen who trudge between brothels and lodging houses with boxes of prints and cheap cameras, offering quick portraits for small fees. Some women like having a picture of themselves looking glamorous, even if the glamour is mostly borrowed from props and flattering lighting. Others worry about what happens if the wrong person sees that image, if a brother or landlord or police inspector recognises their face. Pornography, already, in this age, is risky partly because it fixes identities on paper in a way that gossip alone never could. Distribution is a spider web. Books and pictures travel in bundles wrapped plainly, hidden among more respectable wares. Tobacconists tuck naughty postcards behind jars of pipe tobacco. Newsboys sometimes whisper about special pamphlets available if you know how to ask. Sailors bring back erotic photos from port to port, trading them like collector's cards. Private gentlemen keep locked drawers in their studies where they store both financial documents and volumes that never appear on family bookshelves. One mainstream observation from the time is that prosecutions for obscene materials often uncover not just a few scandalous items, but entire networks of printers, sellers and customers, all pretending surprise even as they reach for their keys. You visit a brothel where the madam has her own stash. In a box under her bed she keeps prints and books to amuse bored clients or to offer as special extras. Sometimes a man pays more if a scene in a book is acted out for him, costumes improvised from whatever clothes are at hand. Women who can read aloud with some drama become extra valuable in these situations. They turn printed smut into live theatre. Between themselves, they mock the bad writing, the unlikely positions, the way certain authors clearly have never met a real woman. Jokes about plot holes and anatomy drift through the corridors after lights out. Historians still argue whether the flood of Victorian pornography reveals a hidden, widespread sexual revolution, or whether it mostly catered to a relatively small group of collectors and thrill seekers. Working class people certainly access it through cheap pamphlets and shared prints, but the more elaborate volumes, with fine illustrations and binding, usually sit in the libraries of those who can afford both books and secrecy. The gap between public morality and private stash size is as wide in some drawing rooms as the gap between official wages and what actually sits in a woman's pocket after a night's work. As you leave the alley of bookshops and back rooms, the city's more visible faces reappear. Respectable newspapers preach about purity. Preachers warn from pulpits that obscene material corrupts the young and poisons the soul. All the while, printers reset type for the next anonymous novella. Photographers mix chemicals for another clandestine session, and somewhere a woman counts the extra coins from posing in stockings for a camera that fogs at the edges. The trade in bodies spills naturally into the trade in images and words, each feeding the other in an unending loop of desire, curiosity and denial. You walk back into the gaslit street carrying, in your mind if not in your hands, the sense of a culture that tries very hard to look chaste while clutching little packets of paper under its coat. Pornography in this world is not a sideshow. It is closely linked to the daily work of prostitutes who pose, act, listen, sell, and sometimes keep a copy of themselves tucked away. Proof that they existed in more than statistics and police reports. The ink may fade and the photographs may crack, but for a brief sharp moment each image or printed scene lets someone step out of the grey routines of life into a fantasy that never appears on any official map. You stand at the mouth of a narrow London alley, and the darkness ahead feels heavier than an ordinary night. Fog curls around the gas lamps, swallowing the light so that each circle of brightness floats like an island. Somewhere a bell tolls the hour, slow and hollow. You feel the familiar mix of coal smoke, damp brick, and stale beer. But under it tonight rides something sharper, a scent of tension that does not belong to the weather. You are about to walk through streets where fear is almost as common as mud. Boots scrape on the cobbles beside you. A woman in a worn shawl hurries past, eyes flicking over every doorway. She's not just looking for a client, she's checking for danger, measuring risks with every step. The city talks endlessly about temptation and corruption, but out here the more urgent subject is survival. Men bargain hard over prices because they know they can walk away. Women bargain hard because they know they might not walk away at all. It is not a poetic metaphor. It is a very practical calculation. Violence is never abstract in these streets. Stories ripple through lodging houses and taverns about men who beat women, men who refuse to pay, men who draw knives when they think no one is watching. The women share warnings like weather forecasts. Avoid that man with the crooked hat. He has a fist like an iron bar. That sailor with the tattooed hands once left a girl in a ditch. That polite clerk who looks harmless likes to squeeze throats until faces turn red. You realise quickly that charm is around 10th on the safety checklist here. One mainstream fact presses itself into the night. In 1888, a series of murders in Whitechapel shocks not just London, but the world. Several women, many of them connected to street prostitution, are found brutally killed in the early hours. Their bodies discovered in alleys and yards that look very much like the one you're standing in. The unknown killer gets a name, Jack the Ripper, and the newspapers gorge on every detail they can print. Rumours spread faster than official statements ever could. You can almost hear the whispered phrase, "Have you heard about the murders?" echoing down every hallway. Historians still argue whether the Ripper murders represent a unique eruption of horror or simply the most heavily publicised example of violence that has always stalked poor women in big cities. Before and after those famous killings, other women are attacked, strangled, beaten and left where the city will barely notice them. Their names rarely become legends. They become statistics, small notes in coroner reports, cautionary tales in the mouths of friends. Fame, it seems, is a strange and unfair thing, even in death. The newspapers of the time do not help anyone sleep better. Reporters swarm the East End, sketching lurid scenes in breathless prose. They describe the narrow courts and filthy lodging houses with a tourist's horrified fascination. Some articles linger on the women's drinking habits or their supposed moral failings, as if they have to remind readers that the victims were not quite like the dear ladies at home. Other pieces flirt with sympathy but cannot quite let go of the thrill of a sensational story. You notice that horror is profitable long before horror films exist. You follow a woman as she walks with a potential client toward a darker corner. She keeps to the edge of the street where the light is just strong enough for her to see his face clearly. She has her own rules. No alleys that end in blind walls. No doorways she has never used before. No appointments with men who refuse to give at least a first name. It is a safety system stitched together out of tiny precautions, none of them foolproof. You might lock your front door once at night. She tries to lock it with every glance. Quirky little habits evolve from this constant sense of danger. Some women carry hatpins longer than seems strictly fashionable, sharp enough to jab a wandering hand or poke an eye if things go very wrong. Others tuck small folding knives into their stockings or keep stones in their pockets. In certain neighbourhoods, they agree that if one of them screams a particular word, the others will come running with whatever makeshift weapons they can grab, from firewood to chamber pots. It may not be an official self-defence class, but it is the best they have. The police presence after a murder spikes briefly. You see extra boots on the ground, hear the clatter of patrols pacing streets that normally merit only a lazy glance. Investigators question lodging housekeepers, barmaids and anyone who might have seen something. They ask what the dead women were like, as if personality can explain a knife. Some officers take the danger seriously, others mutter that women who walk the streets at night must accept the risks. That logic sounds suspiciously like blaming rain on people who forget umbrellas. Historians still argue whether increased policing after such attacks genuinely protects sex workers, or mainly serves to reassure the respectable public that something is being done. For a while, the women may see more officers, more lanterns, more questions. Then, slowly, patrols thin. Life asserts its tired routine. Rent still needs paying. Hunger still demands coins. Fear does not keep the gaslights burning, so the city allows the night to resume its usual business. You step into a common lodging house kitchen just before dawn. The fire glows low, and women trickle back from the streets, shoulders slumped. Some come in alone, others in pairs, talking in urgent whispers about a man who seemed wrong, or a rumour of a body found 2 streets over. They count themselves quietly. Who is back? Who is late? Who has not been seen since midnight? The room holds its breath as names are spoken. Most of the time, someone eventually appears, cursing the late client or the long walk. Sometimes, the silence stretches, and no one meets anyone else's eyes. Fear changes romances too, such as they are. A woman might choose a regular client she does not particularly like because he feels predictable, less likely to flip from charming to dangerous in a single moment. Another might accept lower pay from a man who has always kept his hands gentle. Stability becomes strangely attractive when the alternative is a stranger with unknown habits and a glint in his eye that could be lust or something colder. The usual rules of attraction bow politely and step aside for survival. In all of this, you see that violence against prostitutes is not just physical. It is woven into language and law. Jokes about getting what they deserve and loose women meeting hard ends float through pubs and parlours. When a woman disappears, many assume she has simply moved on, perhaps gone to the bad in another district, as if there were a worse place left to go. Sympathy is rationed carefully. Respectable victims get a full measure. Women who sell sex receive a watered-down version, mixed heavily with judgment, You walk once more along the alley as the sky begins to pale. A cart rattles past carrying vegetables to market. A milkman starts his round. The ordinary city begins to overlay the memories of the night. For the women who work these streets, fear does not vanish with the morning. It settles deeper into their bones, adding itself to every decision. Where to stand, whom to trust, whether the clink behind them is just a bottle or someone following. In this dim borderland between gaslight and sunrise, you understand that the legend of a single serial killer tells only one sharp, dramatic slice of the story. The broader, quieter truth is that every night contains smaller dangers that never make it into penny dreadfuls or history books. A punch in the ribs, a shove down a stairwell, a threat hissed through dirty teeth. The women facing those dangers do not get famous names, just tired faces and careful habits. They keep walking, not because they lack imagination or fear, but because the rent does not wait for safe streets or kind men. You step into a London street where something feels different. The lamps still glow, the pavements still shine with rain, but above the old gaslights you spot new, brighter bulbs strung along a shop front. Electric light hums quietly, cutting the darkness in a way the older glow never quite managed. Trams clatter past, bells ringing. A newsboy calls out headlines about a new century full of progress. You look around and realise that for many of the women who work these streets, progress is something that happens to other people. Near a doorway, an older woman adjusts a shawl. Lines etch her face more deeply than her age alone can explain. She watches a pair of younger girls flit past, laughing, skirts slightly shorter, hats tipped at jaunty angles. They call themselves good time girls as not unfortunates, and they flirt with men outside dance halls as easily as breathing. The older woman has walked these streets since the time when Queen Victoria still sat on the throne. Empire, industry, inventions, all have rolled by overhead while her night stayed stubbornly similar. New words swirl through the city now. Social purity, national efficiency. Respectable men and women gather in halls to discuss the problem of vice. Committees investigate everything from brothels to working-class housing. Pamphlets warn that immorality weakens the race, that drink and prostitution threaten the future of the nation. One mainstream fact stands out among all this talk. In 1885, the age of consent in Britain is raised from 13 to 16, a change many campaigners celebrate as a victory against exploitation. Historians still argue whether that legal shift truly protected vulnerable girls, or mostly gave moralists a fresh tool to criticise behaviour they already disliked. On a Sunday afternoon, you listen at the edge of a crowd in a public square. A woman with a clear, carrying voice speaks from a small platform. She talks about the double standard that expects purity from wives and daughters, while giving husbands and sons quiet permission to seek pleasure elsewhere. She blames not just the women who sell sex, but the men who buy it, and then slide back into respectability. Some in the crowd nod, others scoff and walk away. Early feminists like her fight for the vote, for property rights, for a new understanding of women's place in public life. For the woman under the shawl, these speeches feel both thrilling and distant. Voting would be nice. Paying rent tomorrow still matters more. Laws shift again. Brothel keeping is targeted more harshly, and local campaigns pressure landlords to evict suspected madams. Some well-known houses close, their curtains pulled down, their furniture sold. A few former brothel keepers move into quieter, flat keeping, renting small apartments where women receive clients one by one instead of working in obvious group houses. Others vanish from the trade entirely, leaving the women who depended on them to fend for themselves. You hear more police talk of disorderly houses, more raids aimed at pleasing reformers who want vice off the main streets. The trade does not vanish, it scatters. The older woman finds these changes unsettling. Once she knew which doors hid danger and which doors hid allies, now entire corners change character in a year. A music hall becomes a cinema, drawing different crowds. A familiar tavern replaces its smoky back room with a bright, tiled bar, and a strict new owner who refuses to tolerate women waiting near the entrance. She shifts her ground, learning which new places might tolerate a quiet arrangement, and which have embraced the fresh fashion for looking respectable at all costs. Quirky details creep into moral campaigns. A group of earnest young women hands out tiny white cards printed with vows of purity, urging men to sign promises to remain chaste until marriage. Another society distributes white ribbons and flowers as symbols of clean living. The older woman watches a trio of laughing clerks pin ribbons to their jackets, swearing joking oaths they will forget by Saturday night. The distance between slogans and habits has not shrunk much with the arrival of electric light. At the same time, something new stirs in the language of charity. Instead of speaking only of sin and rescue, some visitors to poor districts start to talk about social work and case studies. They arrive with notebooks, asking about childhoods, wages, illnesses, housing conditions. They want to understand why women enter the trade, at least on paper. The older woman sits stiffly while a young lady with impeccable manners writes down her answers, head tilted sympathetically. Food parcels and offers of temporary shelter appear. So do suggestions that she should move to a home in the country, learn laundry work, leave bad influences behind. Leaving, however, requires more than train fare. It requires believing that the past will not follow her, and that employers will ignore the weight of rumour. That is a gamble she is not sure she can win. In side streets near new factories and workshops, younger women balance paid employment with occasional sex work. A girl on a sewing machine by day becomes a part-time companion by night if wages fail to stretch. She tells herself she's different, modern, not like the women who stand on corners full-time. Labels shift with the fashions. The underlying deal does not. Money for intimacy, discretion for safety, all framed by a world that still judges women far more harshly than men for stepping outside approved boundaries. Historians still argue whether the early 20th century loosening of some sexual norms made life freer for women, or mainly freed men further, while leaving stigma firmly in place for anyone who admitted to selling sex. You walk with the older woman on a chilly evening as she moves more slowly than the girl skipping ahead. Her client list has shrunk. Many men prefer younger faces, newer jokes, different styles of dress. She leans more on regulars who have visited her for years, men who now talk as much as they touch. They bring worries about failing businesses, about sons in trouble, about a changing world they do not quite understand. She listens, nods, sometimes offers blunt advice. She has seen more cycles of hope and disappointment than they have, even if they would never admit it. On a corner, a suffrage procession passes, banners held high, drums beating steadily. Some marchers carry signs about equal pay, some about voting rights, some about ending state interference in women's bodies. The older woman pauses and watches them go by. Shawl pulled tight, half tempted to fall into step. She stays where she is. She cannot risk explaining an arrest if the protest turns rough. Yet something in her lifts at the sound of women's voices raised high without apology. For all the distance between her life and theirs, there is a thin shared thread, a refusal to be entirely invisible. You sense that time is carrying everyone forward whether they like it or not. New trains, new ships, new political parties, new scandals, all arriving one after another. Yet some things cling stubbornly to the cobblestones. A neighbour who finds out about a woman's past still whispers behind her back. A landlord still raises rent because he knows she cannot complain to respectable associations without exposing herself. A girl who leaves the life and tries to marry still fears that some man at the back of the church will stand up and say he remembers exactly where she worked on Saturday nights. As the century turns properly and newspapers start talking about a modern age, you stand on that same street and look around. Buildings change, transport changes, fashions change. The old woman with the shawl eventually disappears from this corner, her story ending quietly in a lodging house bed, or a hospital ward. or a poorhouse dormitory where no one bothers to ask what she once knew about this city after dark. A new girl takes her place, then another, whatever else modernity brings. It does not yet bring a world where these lives are remembered kindly. They fade into the cracks, leaving only regulations, statistics, and the faintest echo of footsteps on wet pavement. You step back from the streets now, as if you are quietly closing a door on a house that has been noisy for a very long time. The gaslight glow fades in your mind, and the echo of carriage wheels and rough laughter drifts away like smoke. You keep hold of one small thing, though. Behind every statistic and scandal there was a person who got cold and hungry, who liked a particular song, who worried about rent, who laughed at bad jokes, who wanted, in some shy corner of their heart, to be safe and seen. As you lie where you are, you feel the contrast. Your pillow is soft, the air around you is familiar. No one is knocking at your door with demands or threats. You can let your shoulders loosen a little. You can imagine folding the heavy cloak of that old city and setting it aside, knowing it will stay in the past where it belongs. For now, you get to stay here, in the present, where the only thing you need to do is rest. Take a slow breath in, as if you are filling your lungs with clean night air, not coal smoke. Let it out gently. Picture the gas lamps blinking off one by one, leaving only a pale early light over empty streets. The women you have walked beside turn away into their own endings, some sad, some stubbornly hopeful. You wish them quiet, warmth and a softness they rarely knew in life. Then you let them go, like silhouettes slipping into mist. Around you, the sounds of your own room settle. Maybe there is the hum of a fan, the distant roll of a car, a clock ticking somewhere out of sight. Each sound is small and safe. Each one reminds you that you are here, not in some alley under a doubtful lamp. Your body can follow your mind into stillness now. Muscles relax, thoughts slow, and the story that has been marching briskly through your head starts to walk more slowly, then simply sit down beside you. If your eyes are still open, you can let them drift closed, like curtains drawn across a window at the end of a long day. There is nothing left you have to see tonight, nothing you need to fix or solve. History can look after itself for a while. You have listened, imagined, cared. That is enough. Now is the part where you do nothing at all except let sleep come when it is ready. Like a late guest who finally knocks softly and steps in. Let the lust of Victorian London fade behind you, its chimneys and cobbles shrinking until they are just a distant pattern. In their place, hold only a quiet sense of compassion for yourself and for people whose lives were much harder than they ever deserved. Carry that softness with you as you drift. Your breathing stays slow, your body heavy and warm, your mind floating just above dreams.